G'day and welcome to another episode of the AthElite podcast, talking all things running biomechanics with our special guest, Patrick O'Connell. So a little bit of a background with Patrick. So he's a podiatrist, but also has a strong background in running biomechanics, and more specifically, long distance running biomechanics. So Patrick, welcome to the podcast and thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, mate. Thanks for having me.
So give us a little bit of a background about yourself. So with your business MovePod and some of the things that you do with MovePod.
Yeah, absolutely. So MovePod I started up at the start of this year. So just moving down to the Geelong Surf Coast area. I've kind of always worked in, I suppose you'd label it sports podiatry or musculoskeletal podiatry. And yeah, just moved down to the area from Melbourne, wanted to start up a clinic that revolved pretty heavily around movement and sports injuries and working with runners and stuff like that. So I suppose MovePod is it's a podiatry clinic, but it's, I suppose, not your typical podiatry clinic. Most people think of a podiatrist as someone that cuts nails and cuts off dead skin. So yeah, it's a little bit different to that, and it's a little bit more focused around movement, strengthening mobility, and helping people stay active so that they can keep doing all the activities that they love doing.
So with your MovePod business, is there a lot of things you do in regards to trying to change the biomechanics of someone's gait and running and movement?
It's not, I suppose it's not a primary focus, going and changing someone's movement straight away. I think there's little tweaks that you can make within someone's walking or running mechanics. But I've found it to be a lot more effective to attack it from a load management, strengthening mobility, footwear point of view, changing all those sort of things around the way that they move, which then has a positive impact on the way that they move, as opposed to going straight in and telling them that they need to land on the ball of their foot, for example. So yeah, I think the other strategies that surround human movement are a little bit more effective.
So I'm assuming you've done this for quite a few years now. So what got you into becoming a podiatrist, and what kind of led you into your passion towards running biomechanics?
My family love running, so my mum's always been a big runner, and she made all of us, me and my brothers and my little sister, runners as well. And there's a few running coaches in the family as well. So yeah, I've always been interested in the space, and after school didn't run for a few years and went more into footy, but after finishing up footy went back into my running. And yeah, I've always enjoyed that sort of space and enjoyed the competition of long distance running. So I suppose that my upbringing had a big role to play in my interest in the area, and that kind of that led me into the working in the health and medical space, and the direction that I wanted to take my podiatry degree.
So I'm assuming you see all different types of clients, whether it's youth and other types of athletes, different sports. So what type of link have you seen between injuries and running biomechanics, or a lack thereof, with running biomechanics?
Yeah, yeah, we do. We see a big mix of clients, and I suppose that I just talk about the runners because I love the runners. I love working with runners, but we see footy players, soccer, hockey, everything, netball, basketball, all sorts of athletes. And when it comes to those sports, yes, biomechanics definitely have a role to play. Whether that's whether that's changes in their biomechanics that they've picked up from previous injuries that have kind of altered the way that they move, or whether it's the way that they naturally move as they grew up. It definitely has a role to play, and I think running technique is something that's undercoached in the early stages and through development. And I think if learning a basic skill like how to run and how to move efficiently can transfer into any of those sports and reduce injury risk in all those sports.
So what injuries do you specifically see? So I'm assuming that there'll be quite a few recurrent injuries that you see with a lot of your clients. So what are some of those injuries?
Yeah, some of the most common, we see a lot of stress fractures or stress reactions. That's a pretty common occurrence, and most commonly we'll see that in runners. And it's a lot of the time it's obviously too much too soon, and then not having the foundational strength and endurance to support that load that you've increased too quickly. So that's a big one, and then there's other factors that play underneath that as well. I suppose you've got the biological factors like bone mineral density and whether they've got good calcium intake and vitamin D levels and iron and all those sorts of things that are important in bone health. So that's a big one. Shin pain is a big occurrence, and I suppose that's a broad term that encapsulates quite a number of injuries that we see. So your tibial stress, some of your tib post irritation, tib ant irritation, compartment syndromes, those sort of injuries that involve the lower leg. And again, that can be any sort of ball sport, or that can be runners that come in with that sort of stuff. Other common ones are heel pain, so posterior heel pain, anything through the back of the heel and up into the Achilles is pretty common, as well as the plantar heel pain and the plantar fascia pain and any of those sort of neural things that can be involved in the plantar heel pain as well.
So with those injuries, in terms of the etiology or the cause of those injuries, would a lot of them be to do with their running biomechanics and maybe poor biomechanics in addition to doing too much too soon? Will that be most of the causes, or is there some other underlying causes, as you mentioned, such as your genetic makeup?
There's whenever we see an overuse injury or a chronic injury, even not so much the acute ones, because things like ankle sprains tend to have less contributing factors than the more chronic stuff. But yeah, when we see some of those chronic overuse injuries, there's usually 5 or 6 factors at play, and you'll be able to identify each one of those in the assessment process, and going through and figuring out is there restriction in certain joints that are contributing to that injury? Is there weakness or deficiencies in certain movement patterns that they're using in their sport? Certainly biomechanics has a role to play in it. So as an example, someone who tends to run up on the ball of their foot is going to be loading their Achilles a lot more than someone who is kind of rear foot striking. But then the person who rear foot strikes is going to be loading the muscles through the front of their shin a lot more. So in that sense, the biomechanics have a significant role to play in what's presenting. But yeah, there's also a lot of other things at play, and I think a huge one for a lot of people is load, because there's so many people who don't run or haven't run for years, and then they try and just go straight back to running 5K or 10K without any sort of progressive build-up and without any sort of foundational strength there.
Yeah, and it is pretty important whether someone is just starting out or whether they're an athlete at an elite level. Management of load, you can't just go too much too soon. Um, Obviously, that's you break down. Doesn't matter how good your genetics are.
As you would know, like you see a lot of the work around training ages and how, like, what is their training age? How long have they kind of been going at it for? Because someone with a really low training age, they're not going to be able to tolerate pretty normal progressions, whereas someone with quite a high training age, they've been going at it for a long period of time. They'll be able to, their body's going to be able to tolerate pretty large fluctuations in load, and you'll be able to work a lot more with them on progressions and faster progressions than someone who hasn't been training for as long.
Yeah, there's so much study going into load and fatigue management at the moment, and there's a lot of things that, because it's such a subjective, if you like. There's a lot of things that, especially at sporting clubs, that like subjective questionnaires. They're finding that to be the most valid, although it doesn't give you a number necessarily. That you can concrete. Same as GPS. GPS gives you a number. Subjective values such as a questionnaire, how you're feeling, 1 to 10, doesn't give you a number necessarily. That's highly valid. But the actual questionnaire in itself, because athletes and people respond differently to training, is probably the most valid kind of way you can load and monitor fatigue. So it is interesting. But yeah, like you said, it is a concern when, especially sporting clubs, local football with the pre-seasons, first day they're doing 15 kilometers. You're just asking to get injured basically.
Yeah, and those, I suppose the good thing with those questionnaires is it gives you a bit of an insight into the individual's mental state as well, and how they're tolerating it from a mental point of view, because that's just as important in their recovery and their progressions, is how they're mentally and psychologically tolerating the load or rehab or whatever it may be.
So some injury prevention and injury risk minimization that you incorporate. Can you give us a little bit of a basically your beliefs and what's worked well with your clients in preventing and minimizing the risk of these injuries, such as your shin splints and your heel pains and all that jazz?
Yeah, patience. Everyone, patience is big. Yeah, like I think more than anything, I think it's because I work with a lot of recreational runners, and a lot of the time they want to run their half marathon, they want to run their marathon, they want to run their ultra marathon within a year of starting running, and it takes so much time to build that base and build a resilient body that can tolerate that load without being injured or breaking down or fatigued or whatever it is. I think patience is number one, and I think that kind of puts a bit of an umbrella over your progressive increases in load, whether that's your aerobic training speed, agility, all that sort of stuff, as well as your strength routine too. So yeah, definitely patience. Any runners who think they can just run and not do any strengthening, I tend to highlight the importance of strength training. And when you're first starting, it doesn't need to be anything huge or complex. It can just be a few exercises 2 to 3 times a week for a real beginner. But yeah, certainly incorporating some form of strength training into your weekly routine. That's a great injury preventer. And then some other injury preventers are smaller things like turnover of your shoes. How often are you turning over your shoes? How many Ks are you clocking up in your shoes? And then looking at how you're recovering too. So what are you eating, drinking? How much sleep are you getting? What's your I suppose, what's your psychological state like? You're stressed at work, all that sort of stuff, all kind of plays into the stress levels, recovery levels, and then in turn progressions.
So back into the biomechanics now. So I deal a bit more with the sprinting and the development of speed, more than your longer distance kind of running like yourself, like your marathons and your half marathons and ultra marathons, etc. And there's a big emphasis on, knee height, joint angles, stride length, stride frequency, getting that figure 4 knee angle and hip angle at the mid stance and all that jazz. What are some of the biomechanical principles for ultra marathons and these marathons and longer distance events, such as, your stride frequency, your stride length, and other kind of biomechanical principles? What are the most important ones?
Yeah, it changes quite a lot, and it's more like, I suppose you'd put it on a bit of a spectrum of how these joint angles change from your really cruisy slow running all the way through to your higher speed running. And someone who's running at a really gradual pace over a long period of time, they would tend to have a lower level of hip extension on propulsion. So they're not going to kind of extend out through the hip quite as much as they push off. And then they'll have lower they'll have less hip flexion and less knee flexion as they're coming through swing phase as well. They'll kind of tend to keep their feet a little bit lower and closer to the ground, just so they're, I suppose, preserving energy and making the most of their energy over a longer period of time. Whereas as you get into those faster events, they really need to get more hip extension through that push off. And then as they're coming through swing phase, they're really getting more knee and hip flexion, which I was listening to something just the other day, and it's talking about the reason why that happens. And it's basically just reducing the size of the lever arm so that it can come through faster and then come back through again.
And the reason why I asked you this was because at the elite level in marathons, they've found that in research, genetics doesn't play a massive part. This is when everyone's basically the best of the best. Someone's VO2 max doesn't play a massive part in basically whoever wins and whoever comes last, pretty much. It's actually to do with their running efficiency is the biggest contributor to whoever's the winner compared to, who comes second or who comes 20th. So running efficiency is so big, but like you said before, it doesn't really get coached a lot, especially in the health and strength and conditioning field.
Yeah, it's it absolutely, especially when you're playing with seconds at the highest level, and it's over such a long period of time. Your running efficiency makes a huge difference because it's all about how much energy you're consuming and how much you've got left over for the later stages in the race. So you can see why that would be so important. And even when you're talking about that, you read about the Kenyan runners and I suppose their training system in their town in Iton in Kenya. Like they have a large focus on running technique when they first go into the programs, and that's kind of as they're coming up as teenagers and that sort of age group. They have a really high focus on that sort of stuff. So you can see and you can understand why that would make such a large difference.
So in these long distance events, do you think stride frequency is more important than stride length, or what's your take on that?
I think they've both got a role to play. I think I was watching a breakdown of I think it was a 10,000 meter race the other day, and they were chatting about this stride frequency, stride length stuff, and how we say the ideal cadence is about 180 steps per minute. But talking about the variations in that as well. And what they noticed was the athletes that naturally use their high cadence to keep up with the pack earlier in the race will tend to increase their stride length later in the race to try and get faster as the pack breaks away. Whereas the ones who use their stride length earlier in the race with a lower cadence, they'll switch that later in a race, and they'll shorten their stride length and increase their cadence later in the race to try and break away from the pack. So I think it's slightly different for each athlete, and I suppose in those cases, what they use when they're fresh and feeling good then goes and changes when they're fatigued and they need to switch it on to go faster.
Stepping away from the biomechanics for a second, so onto a different type of exercise. So barefoot exercises, are they beneficial? Are they do they help with things like injury prevention? So what's your take on them?
Yeah, I think they're undervalued. And I was saying this to you before, I think the reason they're undervalued is because at this stage they're under-researched, and it's probably an area that needs to have a little bit more of a look into, because I personally find it really helpful, and I think it's super effective in as part of the whole treatment plan in improving your efficiency through your feet. And if the foot muscles aren't strong and stable enough to be able to absorb load and propel forward themselves, then you're working with I suppose a dead fish. Like there's no point having it attached to the end of your leg if it's not energy efficient. So I think it plays a big role, and I think working on them is important for a lot of these injuries that we work with, like your plantar fascia stuff, your Achilles stuff. Having really strong intrinsic foot plantar flexors is just so helpful in absorbing load and then driving you forward.
What about things like running barefoot? Not necessarily just for your long distance, just for kind of your injury prevention and your prehab exercises. Is that something that you've also found beneficial?
Yeah, I like just people doing like a little portion of it initially as part of their session. Getting that feel for ground contact barefoot and being able to absorb that load and propel without the help of a shoe underneath you, I think is really important. I suppose before you go and jump into things like that, you can do things like barefoot exercises and really low level plyometrics barefoot, and then going into higher ankle jumps, single leg, double leg, whatever it may be, barefoot. So you're building up a little bit of that strength and elasticity through the foot and ankle before you then go and run barefoot. So I think, first building on the foot strength and plyometric stuff, and then transferring it into adding a bit of barefoot running into some sessions throughout the week is important.
And lastly, before we finish up, what's your stance on orthotics?
Yeah, I think that they have their role to play, but only in specific situations. I do think that they're overused in some settings, and I think they have been for quite a while. And I think the way that they've been used is a bit different to how they're being used now. So over the past kind of 20, 30 years, they've been a really rigid structure that kind of blocks your motion and prevents pronation, because pronation is bad. But that's really not the case anymore, and we know that, and the shoe industry's moved away from that, and the health industry's moving away from that as well. So I think they've got their place, but I think they just need to be used with caution and in the right scenarios, and used more as I suppose a flexible device that's used proprioceptively, but then is only there as an adjunct to the treatment plan that you already have in place. So it shouldn't be thought of as a silver bullet and the be all and end all in treatment. It should only be used as like your little 10 to 20% of your whole treatment plan that involves your strength, your mobility, your technique, how you're moving, and your progression of load. So it's got a role to play, but I don't think it's as big of a role as it has been made out to be in the past.
Yeah, some interesting stuff, because most podiatrists, they get people depending on the injury, obviously, or depending what you're seeing them for. But with athletes, most of them, I think, prescribe. Would you use prescribe as the word? So prescribes to get orthotics and just to basically change or slightly adjust some of your biomechanics in your movement patterns. But it is interesting because you see some people, they use it with everything, with their footy boots, runners, work shoes, pretty much any footwear, even their casuals. So it is a bit interesting to have kind of a different opinion and different kind of insight into them.
And it's interesting when you ask some of those people, you ask them if they remember why they got the orthotics in the first place, and half the time they won't have a clue. They'll just say, "Oh, I got them when I was 7 years old, and I've had them ever since." And they just kind of get them. They just kind of get them remade every couple of years, and it's interesting because they wouldn't even know why they have them anymore. So in some cases, you can start to move people out of them, work on a bit more strength and how they're moving, and a lot of people can move away from being so heavily reliant on them and move a little bit more into some natural movement. In other cases, people require them, but it's always just as an adjunct, never as a standalone.
Pat, thank you very much for taking the time to join us on the AthElite podcast. So really appreciate your time, and it's definitely some awesome insights into running biomechanics.
Perfect. Thanks for having me, mate.